Okay, so today is Wednesday, March 13th. My name is Salvador Castro, and I'm interviewing Dr. Nestor Rodriguez for the Voces Oral History Project at the University of Texas at Austin. As you know, the interview will be housed at the library of the Nittany Lee Benson Latin American Collection in Austin. If there's something you don't want to talk about, you do not have to, but if there's something you wish to, we encourage you to do so. At any point during the interview you wish to stop for whatever reason, please say so. Again, thank you for taking time out of your day to be here.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. So, if you wouldn't mind, could you please say your name and how you're related to the ANI and Del Mar College and what you're
Okay,
doing?
my name is Nestor Rodriguez, and I'm related to Del Mar College, actually in different ways, or two important ways. One, my father was a janitor there for 27 years, and sometimes I would help him, like in the weekends, to clean up auditoriums, things like that. So it's a place where I worked a little bit, but it's also where I went to college the first 2 years, and so I have that experience. When I finished at Del Mar, almost finished, I say almost finished because I never graduated with an associate's because you need 60 hours, and I think I only had 59 hours. Anyway, so I transferred over to Texas A&I in Kingsville and became a student there, an undergrad student. I graduated from there, and I became a graduate student there. I graduated from there, and a year later, I became an instructor there in sociology.
And what are you doing today?
Today, I am a professor in the Department of Sociology here at UT Austin.
Okay. All right. So, I know you're from Corpus Christi when you grew up. So, what was it like growing up in Corpus Christi?
What was it like growing up in Corpus Christi? Well, it was many things. You know, growing up, you're a child. Everything is exciting or challenging, right? So sort of the normal childhood. So it was a good experience in that way. But Corpus Christi is also it has for many people limited economic opportunity. So it was growing up in neighborhoods that were all Mexican American, great families, but often not a lot of opportunity, right? So you have these challenges of growing up with minority group status, right? So it's like growing up as a Mexican American in the 50s and the 60s, right? Or late 40s, 50s, and 60s as a minority in a setting where that really means something, you know, institutional exclusion, discrimination, things like that.
One thing. So, you're saying it was exciting growing up as a kid. Did you guys ever visit the beach pretty often?
You know what? My mother had illnesses, so I didn't have a normal childhood in that regard, like all kids go to the park and go to the beach or whatever. And so I didn't have that level of parental support because my mother was ill, and so I didn't go to the beach often. And in fact, my mother was afraid that I would drown or something. So I didn't never learn how to swim or anything, but I did go a few times.
So, how did that kind of affect it, your mother like being ill? So, in that regard, you couldn't go to the beach and things. How did that affect the family life?
Well, I mean, when someone is ill in the family, it can have major effect. My mother was ill. She had mental issues, health problems, and so it had major effect is the way we grew up, right? And I didn't participate in many things that normal kids participate in. And again, my mother was great as a mom, right? But she couldn't like give you all the support that moms usually give to their children because she was ill.
All right. So, that brings another question. What was your family like? How many brothers and sisters did you have?
An older brother is about 2.5 years older than me, and so just my brother and I, and my mother and my father.
So, since your mother was ill, how did that kind of affect your relationship with your father, your brother?
Uh, well, growing up as a little boy in the 50s, I was born in 48, so I was in the 50s, I'm a little boy. That's what I remember growing up, right? This is a traditional Mexican American family, right? So relationships are like with my father were traditional, male oriented, right? In those days, fathers didn't hug their sons and kiss them and things that parents do now, right? That's encouraged. Love your children. My father loved me a great deal, but I mean, it was not at that time. It was not a style of relationship to be kissing and hugging and things like that. among men, right, among males, right. So, and my father was very busy helping my mother, and he actually had like two roles, being father and being a mother, because my mother could, sometimes she could do things in the house, sometimes she couldn't, so my father would take over and do housework. In addition to working where he did, he also did housework. So he was very busy trying to take care of my mother in the house.
Wow. Could you explain what a traditional Mexican household is, just for people that don't know what a traditional Mexican household would be like?
It's like you have gender roles, like boys are supposed to do this. They don't, they hang out with their dad or whatever, right? They don't play with dolls and things like that. And so that what girls are supposed to do and boys are supposed to do is well defined, right? It doesn't mean that they don't interact or that they don't overlap. They do, right? But there are different expectations. For me, though, because my mother was ill, I did things that in other households boys wouldn't do, like wash dishes and clean up and stuff like that. Like, 'cause I had male friends who never did that because their sisters were doing it, right?
So that kind of leads into the next question. So when you were, since you kind of had this traditional, what was it like growing up in that, and growing up in the community of Corpus Christi, growing up in the 50s and 60s? What was it like that community?
Well, I mean, all kinds of different dimensions to talk about. One was it's a regular Mexican American neighborhood, so it's a bilingual bicultural. But when I was growing up, it was more Spanish language neighborhood, right? The language of the parents was Spanish, right? Some parents had gone to school. My mother went to the 7th grade before my grandfather pulled her out because he thought, if you're a girl, you don't need to go beyond 7th grade. And if you do, it's because you're looking for a boyfriend or something, right? They didn't appreciate or understand the need of education for girls, right? So a neighborhood of working class people and lower working class as well. That is, many people had just left the countryside. There were peasants, including my own parents started out in sharecropping families, right, as children. So they were like the first to move into a city, Corpus Christi, right? And so there's a transition there that can be challenging for people to adapt to a city because they're used to the norms of rural areas, right? If they don't have a great education, you're not going to get the great job, so you're going to have low income, and you're going to depend on your relatives to help you survive and things like that. Luckily for me, I guess, my father had a lot of initiative and drive, and so he was able to find most of the good jobs that were stable, right? There were still laborer jobs, not anywhere in the occupational hierarchy, right? But it and my parents bought a house. It's a one room, then they built a kitchen, then they built a bathroom, right? But by having our own home, we didn't have to move around renting places. And that's one of the things that affects education when kids move around a lot because their parents are looking for different houses to rent. And then the kids are pulled out of school. That becomes a huge disadvantage. And I didn't have that. So I grew up in the same house.
At any point, did it ever seem like you guys were going to be leaving, or was it set in stone that, this is our home, we're not going to?
Oh yeah, it was pretty much set in stone. There wasn't, once you had a house, you didn't want to leave, right? There was a time early on in the early 40s or something, 1940s, my father found a job at the Naval Air Station. There used to be a big Naval Air State to train fighter pilots and stuff in the Navy. And so when Eisenhower became president, that's in the 1950s, Eisenhower, to reduce the budget, closed down the base, or the Naval Air Station. And so my father was given the option, we can transfer you to San Diego in California, right? So you don't lose your job, But my brother and myself, I think partly my mother, we didn't want to leave. So there was a time we could have left to California. Everybody was going to California in the 50s from Texas, and we decided that's not what we want. Yeah.
So was that a family decision? Or
Sort of, yeah, sort of. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, you grew up in this Mexican American community. Were the schools at all segregated when you growing up in there?
They were segregated, well, in two ways. They were racially segregated for blacks. Corpus is a small, less than 10% at that time, maybe 8% of the population was black. And by law, they went to a black school system. Okay, so legal segregation for blacks, right? Mexican Americans were also segregated, but it seemed to be more because of segregated by neighborhood, meaning Mexican Americans lived in neighborhoods that were Mexican Americans. Non-Hispanic whites lived in neighborhoods that were where non-Hispanic whites lived. So, and then we had neighborhood schools, right? And so we went to separate schools. And in my school was from the first grade to the sixth grade. We didn't have kinder or pre-kinder, whatever in those days. Every single student was a Mexican American child, except for one girl who was white, Phyllis. I can still remember her name, Phyllis, and she was the only white girl, non-Hispanic white, in our school. Everybody else was Mexican American.
So how did that seem like to you? So this is a whole bunch of Mexican Americans, you know,
Yeah,
essentially almost, let's say you guys almost look all the same. I'm not sure if that's what you thought. We all look the same. And
yeah.
then there's a white girl. And how, was that kind of like shocking to you?
Not really, because now I have the consciousness of race and ethnicity, right? But I was a kid, I was a child, right? Then I didn't have the concepts of race or ethnicity or segregation. I thought it was normal, right? People went to school near where they lived, and this is where I went to school, right? And to me, Phyllis, I mean, she looked different. She had long blonde hair and everything. But she was just a regular student, and the other students were friendly, and she was just a normal, as far as I could see, kid. So I mean, I did notice her because she was different, right? But I never dwelled on that. It was just she's different. Hmm.
Oh, so, so now thinking back on it, now you have this concept.
Yeah.
Does that kind of affect you at all? It's like you go back and you realize it's like, oh wow, I didn't realize it was this.
Yeah. Now after I went to college and majored in sociology, I figured out social structures and discrimination and exclusion, right? And what it means to me now was we were part of the Southern practice of racial discrimination and segregation. And in many other ways, I knew that later as I became a teenager or whatever, I learned about segregation, right? Because there were places we couldn't go, Mexican Americans could not go to in Corpus where we weren't allowed in, right? So I got the message, right? And now I think back and what I think, I don't think so much of the students when I reflect back on my experience in public school, in elementary or middle school. We used to call it junior high. Now they call it middle school. I don't think about the students. I think about the teachers. Most of our teachers were white, and I wondered how they felt having to teach in a Mexican school, right? And I wondered if they were sent there as punishment or what, right? Because there were many all-white schools, which were better. They were newer, had laboratories, whatever, and that's probably where many teachers probably wanted to teach. I don't know that, but I'm assuming, right? Though there were many great white teachers in the Mexican schools, and I was fortunate to have been taught by some of them.
Wow.
Hmm.
So when you went to elementary school, were you guys forced only to speak English, or could you mix?
Yeah, that was a policy, and it varied by classroom, right? Different teachers, and so some were strict, others were less strict. I remember Mrs. Thornton in the sixth grade, and she had a rule, right? Well, she would assign certain of the students, we're all Mexican Americans, right? She would assign certain of the students to be monitors in the playground, to see who was using Spanish, right? And then we had to pay a penny for every Spanish word that we got recorded on, right? Like, so, but then at the end of the year, not at the end of the year, maybe she took all the pennies. In those days, in the 50s, pennies were worth something. Excuse me.
Very good.
She took all the pennies and bought cookies and Kool-Aid and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
So we were, I guess, penalized, but then the penalty was at the end, right, that we would get sweets and stuff like that.
Do you remember how many times you spoke Spanish? Did you ever have to put a penny into the?
I don't remember how many times, but everybody was speaking Spanish. I mean, we were kids, right? And so we grew up in Spanish-speaking households, so that was the common language.
Wow. So, growing up in that elementary, going into middle school, knowing you couldn't speak Spanish, how did that impact you?
Well, because we're kids, right? And the schools represent an authoritarian structure. Your parents are always telling you, do what the teacher tells you, you know? So I thought that's the rule. You know, I never questioned it. Yeah, because again, I didn't have a political or even a social consciousness yet. Yeah.
Looking back at it now, does it upset you at
Well,
all?
it doesn't upset me. I understand how it helped reproduce structures of inequality, right? That obviously the Mexican American culture was not appreciated. This is the 50s, right? And so I think they saw it as a problem, the institutions of school and others, right? And not as a resource.
So, and how long did that last? Like, did it go all the way to Did it go all the way to
No,
high
in
school?
middle school there was nothing about don't speak Spanish. I'm sure some teachers didn't like it. There are some teachers today who don't like it. You know, I have students in my classes who tell me, you know, that in high school they were told not to use Spanish on campus or whatever, right? But in middle school was kind of like a wild time because that's when kids are growing up. They're getting ready to become young adults, and they're joining gangs and things like that. So I went to an inner city middle school that had gangs that had violence at times. I remember one kid was shot and killed in my school by another kid. Right? There was that type of situation.
Oh wow, that's sad.
Yeah, that wasn't new because in my neighborhood, I mean, there were, how should I say, there were gangs and big adult gangs and fights and shootings and stabbings. I mean, growing up in my neighborhood, you probably saw somebody get shot or stabbed, or you saw a body on the street bleeding to death, something like that. That was the environment we lived in.
And that was just the way of life. Nobody.
It was the way of life, but I mean, your parents would tell you, don't get involved with gangs, don't get involved with drugs, don't get involved in situations that can turn violent. So you saw it's the way of life for those people, who
So,
do those things.
how did you avoid all that? How did you say it's like, no, we're not?
That's a very good question because well, I was saved almost religiously by science. And so there's a whole story. Do you want me to go into it now?
Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
Remember I told you my father was a janitor at Del Mar?
Yes.
Okay, he had a great job in the Naval Air Station as a federal employee, but because we didn't move to San Diego, right? He became unemployed. When they closed the Naval Air Station, he no longer had a job. So he bought a couple of lawnmowers and edgers and did yard work, and that was survival. He was very committed to work. I mean, that's all he thought about. We need food. I'm going to work, right? But eventually, he found a job at what we used to call the junior college, or now they call them community colleges, right? Del Mar. And he found a job as a grounds maintenance, cleaning cutting the grass and doing work on the plants and stuff like that. And when you're doing that, you want to work inside a building, not outside, because you're in the rain, the cold. And so eventually, yeah, they promoted him to work in cleaning inside the classrooms and all of that, the restrooms. But when you're hired to clean as a janitor to work inside, indoors, they give you the night shift, right? So my father started with the night shift working indoors. And they gave him the science building to clean as one of the buildings, right? So, and I'm talking about, God, it must be like the late 50s, something like this, or very early 60s. So he's cleaning the science building. And in those days, education was less expensive. And so were the books, right? So it was not uncommon to see students throw away their textbooks, big, thick chemistry and botany, whatever. And so when my father would clean the science building at night, he'd find the textbooks, and instead of throwing them in the big dumpster, he would bring them home for me to read. He thought these are valuable things, right? And so they're sources for education. So I was like by then like in the 6th or 7th grade, and my father was bringing home chemistry and botany, and my brother had already expressed an interest in science, especially astronomy. And so I thought, man, there's something here. And so I began to read, right, more and more, and got really interested in science, right? I don't ask me why psychologically, but I did, right? And so instead of joining gangs, right, I just threw all my time into reading books on science, right? Einstein, I bought copies of his theory of relativity and his special theory of relativity. And I didn't understand everything, but I got the gist of it, right? And then like my first job as a boy was picking cotton in South Texas, when cotton was picked by hand, not by machines, right? So I'd go, my parents took me to pick cotton, and I think they did it mainly to teach me how to work, not to fear work, right? But to look forward to it, make it a resource. So I was saving my money picking cotton, partly to buy clothes to go to school, but also I saved money and I bought a telescope and a microscope. So I had my own, in that one room house, it's actually 3 rooms. There's a little kitchen and a little bathroom, right? I turned it into my lab, right? And I could see, with my telescope, a 3-inch reflector, I could see the moons of Jupiter, and I could see the rings of Saturn right from my backyard. So I really got into science and math. I mean, I understood that the language of science is math. So I really got into math. And I had to teach myself because I was not going to have those classes in middle school till later, right? And so I got kind of like head start in science and a lot of interest, and I didn't want anything to do with anything else, right? And that was the way I kind of survived it. I don't want to say much about this, but within my family, there have been people who unfortunately took a different path, no? And so, but my parents were very concerned that I didn't do that, right? And so science was the way out for me and survival.
That's pretty like tough for 6th and 7th grader to
Yeah,
understand all these things. College material, essentially.
right.
I know that when you said your last interview, you basically just were a straight A student in high school because you were taking these science classes. You were educating yourself.
Right.
So you went from high school to Del Mar, but you didn't take Del Mar seriously, and you had flunked out. Why?
I took it very seriously. In fact, I got awards. I got science awards at Del Mar, right? But I got in. I had a personal problem, a relationship, and it just didn't work out. And everybody became involved, taking sides, my side or her side, right? And it became impossible to live in the neighborhood, and I needed a way out. And so I decided the way, where do I go, right? I need to get out of here. Life is unbearable. And so I decided, almost like on the spur of the moment, to join the Army. Mm-hmm. So one morning I'm driving to campus, I take a left turn, and I drove to the recruiter's office, and I asked to join.
What year did all this take place?
That was 1968. That was April 26th. Well, maybe it was 25th of 1968.
When you look back at it now, do you kind of regret that happened to you? Do you wish it would have gone
I've
different?
always had mixed feelings because who in the heck is going to join the Army during the height of the Vietnam War? The Tet Offensive was the time of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. Many soldiers were going and dying and stuff like that, right? But of course I was ignorant and naive. I was dumb. I didn't know it. I thought it would be like the Hollywood movies, like John Wayne or something. You come back a hero or something. And so, I've often thought I did a very dumb thing. But not too long ago, maybe a couple of years ago or a year ago, I had a conversation with a friend who's like, almost like an educational psychologist. And after I described the situation, she said, "You did the right thing because you removed yourself from a toxic environment." Right? I hadn't thought about that. And that was true. And in fact, I avoided the draft, which for sure would have sent me to Vietnam. I avoided the draft by enlisting, right? Because they put me on another track. And so when I got into the military, everybody takes a battery of tests. And I tested high, okay? And so they made me the offer if I wanted to go to West Point Prep School, which I thought, okay, I'm in for 3 years. I enlisted. I could have enlisted for 2, but the recruiter didn't tell me that. So I enlisted for 3. So I said, okay, I know I'm going to do a year stateside and a year likely in Vietnam. And so I don't want to spend 2 years in Vietnam. So I said, yeah, I want to go to West Point Prep School. And I went to West Point Prep School. And I was accepted into West Point. But at the end there, I decided I don't want to be an officer. I want to be a scientist. So I didn't go to West Point.
And that just kind of set the motion for now, right?
Yeah, right.
I wanted to go back to Del Mar.
Sure.
So you had a scholarship to go there because you had a job. In the last interview you had mentioned you had a job. It just went out my mind. The job. Could you mention what the job was again?
I mean, odd jobs. I picked cotton. I mean, if you want to call that a job, it was a job. It was more than a job. Also, I got a scholarship from the district director of the Social Security office. He gave me a scholarship. There was a competition. He invited like 4 or 5 of us over to his house for dinner. He gave us a riddle, and I solved it, right? And so he gave me a scholarship to go to Del Mar and paid for books and stuff like that. And so that's how plus I think I got LULAC gave me some scholarship. AT&T, Southwestern Bell gave me a bond or something. So I had a little support. But education was not terribly expensive in those days. The state, I think, subsidized more. A semester, I would pay like $128 for tuition and everything. Books were usually less than $10. And I mean thick books. Yeah.
So was anybody ever disappointed that you left? Or that you?
Everybody was disappointed. The district director who gave me the scholarship, right? Because he also gave me a work study job in the Social Security Administration office, where he was the top guy, right? And so when I went to the recruiter's office to join the Army, I didn't tell anyone. I just went and I asked them to take me immediately, which they did. Usually the guy said, look, you want 2 weeks or 30 days, and then we can ship you out to San Antonio as the enlistment center. And I told him, no, I want to leave now, today. I said, okay. So everybody was disappointed. I left. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone. I just left.
Just hightailed it out of there.
Yeah, I just hightailed it out. So everybody, Horace Cleveland, Mr. Horace Cleveland was the district director of Social Security for the Corpus area. And so he was very disappointed. And I think they kind of got the idea, like, this is what's wrong with minorities. They don't stick it out. They just cut bait and run, right? But you know what? His wife, who had been an officer in the Navy, his wife, she never lost faith in me. Because when it was announced in the Corpus Christi newspaper that I was given an appointment to West Point, she was like, you see, I was right. Of course, then my picture came out in the Corpus paper, right, little story about me and stuff. So I was redeemed myself, right?
But you never finished West Point.
I didn't go to West Point. I went to the prep school. It's a 1-year, Fort Belvoir, Virginia, outside of D.C.
So when you came back,
Mm-hmm.
you know, did anybody ever influence you to go back to college, or was that just your own decision?
You know what? When I came back, I had a big question mark. Do I still have it? You know, or do I go with cousins and look for work at the Sears warehouse or something, which is fine, decent, honest work, right? So I said, okay, I'm gonna go back, and I'm gonna go in the summer, see if I still have it. And I did. I mean, I went back I was on, I think they call it probation. I almost want to call it parole, academic probation, because when I left, remember, I didn't withdraw, so all my classes became Fs and stuff, right? So when I come back, my GPA is really bad, and so they put me on probation, academic probation. But I mean, I took all math. I would take math and science because they were the easiest for me, and I raised my GPA up quickly, and then I left for Kingsville, Texas A&I Kingsville. And I can still go back to Del Mar and graduate because I think I have 59 hours. If I take just 1 hour of credit, I can get an associate's certificate or whatever.
Are you going to?
No, so I think about it just for fun, but I don't think so. I'm happy with my PhD.
So, when you came back from the military and
Yeah.
you were on academic probation, if you never went to the military, do you think you would have survived? Do you think I'm pretty sure the military prepared you for hire to come back to Del Mar. It's like, okay, let's go finish this. Let's do
Well, I mean,
this.
the military gives you discipline, and so, but I, to be honest, my original sense of discipline came from my father. He had this my grandfather, the whole family, a very strong work ethic. There's sometimes I read economic theories, labor market theories, that people are poor because they need motivation, and but quite the opposite is what happens in many neighborhoods that have families and people who will try anything, extreme values of hard work. Growing up, when I was picking cotton, women would get up at 4 in the morning, 4:30, and make tortillas and prepare tacos and then they'd get all the family into the big trucks to go pick cotton. So the working class, the poor working class, a lot of motivation. They just need the opportunity. And so I already had the discipline. No son wants to disappoint his father, right? And so I was always into work, right? And so to me, going back to Del Mar was really, do I still have it? Can I succeed? And it was about science for me.
And so when you came back, you went to Del Mar, and then you decided to go to Texas A&I. Do you think you wanted to go to Texas A&I because you went to the military? Did that kind of?
No, I wanted to be a scientist. But I made a big decision going to A&I because I changed majors. My majors were physics and mathematics. But when I came back, in addition to going to Del Mar, I got involved with a movement called the Chicano movement. And in my county, there was a group that was starting Raza Unida Party. And I became very interested in social movements, not because of the social aspect of it, but because of science. Because studying physics, you study physical laws, the laws of heat and motion and light. And I wondered if social relations and society also operated according to laws, like social laws, right? And so I knew I wasn't going to find the answers for that in physics. I'd have to go into a social science. And for some reason, I wanted to take a course on Marxist social science. And so I looked for a course at A&I before I arrived to see where could I take a course on Marx, right? And the only department that offered it was sociology, so that's why I majored in sociology. But then I quickly also double majored in political science and minored in math. I always kept math.
Could you repeat the name of that party again? It was
La Raza Unida Party.
La Raza Unida Party. So when you joined the La Raza Unida Party, were you also involved there when you went to A&I?
Did I what? I'm sorry.
Were you still involved with the party when you went to A&I?
I think it was more when I was transitioning. When I came back from the military, I went to Del Mar only for like a summer, and then I transitioned to Kingsville, Texas A&I in Kingsville. So I was involved. Yes, I was going to college, and yeah.
So how did that impact your life at A&I, and what was A&I like?
Oh God, it was a moment of the Chicano. The Chicano movement was very alive, probably at the tail end, but still very alive, right? So I remember that when I came back from the military, I had never read a book on Mexican Americans.
You're good.
Excuse me. Okay, so when I went to A&I, I discovered there a lot of youth were involved in the Chicano. So I discovered, Mexican Americans are involved, and I wanted to be part of it for two reasons, or for several reasons. One reason is I can learn about a social movement, right? Social behavior, and I guess the personal reason because by then I understood discrimination and social injustice. And so here's a, you can become involved, right? And my role was very minor. I was like at the bottom of the leadership hierarchy. I was the gopher in the Raza Unida party headquarters in the county, which was a tiny room in the barrio, the Mexican American neighborhood, right? So I was the guy that cleaned the floors and lined up the chairs when we were going to have a meeting. I didn't have I didn't have the charisma. There were other guys and women with charisma, and they were the leaders of the party in the county, right? I didn't care. I just wanted to be in there and learn, right? And so, but campus at A&I had many, I was going to say several, but actually many young people, Mexican Americans involved in Chicano movement, the cause, Raza Unida, developing awareness and consciousness in all those things. So it was like a hotbed. And so I think I learned a lot, not just in the classroom, but in the social relations of campus with other students.
What year was this?
We're talking about now, I went into the Army in April of 68, and I got out of the Army in April 26 of 71.
71.
So we're looking at the fall of 71 and the following year, 72. Mm-hmm.
And so how did that kind of change? Did that change like your mindset? Did that open up your...
Well, I think what it to me, I think it did two things, right? One was that it contributed to my theoretical understanding of society and movements and minorities, right? So I began to understand these concepts of inequality and justice, exploitation, right? From the experience of my group, the Mexican American people. And this was not really totally original, because growing up, my father, for some reason, had a conflict perspective and very intellectual. And he explained that we were like the dispossessed people, that there was a time in which Mexicans owned land in Texas, and it was Mexico, but there had been a war, and another group had taken over our lands, right? So he had this conflict perspective that helped me understand why Mexican Americans in Corpus were often poor, right? So my father had that perspective. So I kind of already had this sense of inequality and structural relations that suppress people and things like that that I got from him, which was ironic because my father only went to the first grade. Apparently he was a bully in the first grade. My grandfather said that he pulled my father out of the first grade, out of school, because he was tired of coming home and having mothers lined up complaining about my father beating up their kids, right? So my father got to the first grade.
When you were at A&I, you mentioned you had a professor, Stanley
Bittinger. Yeah, Stanley Bittinger, for many of us, was like this mentor. He was very sensitive to the suffering of people. I think he was ordained as some kind of minister or something, but he never like used that, but we knew he was, right? He also supported the Quakers, who were for peace and things like that. So he got his PhD here at UT Austin, and so he went to Kingsville and became a professor. And so he worked closely with Mexican American students. He would take many of us to Mexico on trips, often camping and stuff like that. And he taught the Mexican American subculture course in sociology, and he traveled around the world to look at other groups and their situations and into Central America, right? So he had a broad view of humanity and the differences of living conditions and economic opportunities, things like that, right? And then he had this gentleness that was probably his most powerful part of his personality, was a gentleness. So he showed us, right, how to survive, how to cope, how to investigate, and you can do it through peace. You know, so it was almost everyone I knew that became an important figure in Raza Unida or the Chicano movement knew him and met with him and interacted with him and had very strong positive opinions of him.
Was he ever involved in any of those two parties?
Excuse me?
Was Mr. Billinger ever involved in those two parties?
No, but he was very involved in counseling us and giving us advice, especially giving us advice how to maneuver on campus, because the system, the A&I university system, would count down hard sometimes on the Chicano activists. For example, I think one time the governor went to the campus and there was a big demonstration by the Chicano students against him, right? And so they wanted to investigate and find out who organized the protests and stuff like that. And Bittinger, Stanley Bittinger, kind of helped us survive that and maneuver through it. You know, he was a very decent, and still is a very decent man, a powerful mentor. Yeah.
So, what does he mean to you now? Do you still see him as a mentor? Or do you see him?
Oh yeah, I mean, I try to model my own style of teaching and relations with students after him, right? I mean, he had great respect for people, right? And I probably shouldn't say this, but I will, because I think it just speaks to his greatness, right? That I remember there were some students from like Thailand that were international students, and so their visa was, whether they had a visa or not, was based on their grades. And I remember that he graded their exam once, and I think he fudged on their grades so that they would be saved, you know. So that, I guess what I'm saying, he talked about there's the goals of the bureaucracy, and then there's the other greater goals of humankind and humanity, and how do we enhance the quality of life. And sometimes you have to go and be more faithful to what's good for humankind and to what's good for a bureaucracy.
Wow, he sounds like a really great person.
Yeah, it was great.
So did you ever get to expose, you were exposed to the Chicano movement at A&R or at Del Mar?
A&I really, but
At A&I.
keep in mind that at Del Mar, I was just there for a summer after I came back from the military.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, did you ever grow up? Did you ever raise up in the ranks of the Chicano movement? Did you?
No, and I was like, even in class when I was a student, I would always sit in the back row. For some reason, I never wanted to be noticed, you know. And so even in the Raza Unida party, I became a notary, and all of us were notaries because we needed to register people to vote. And when you register people, you need to be a notary, right? So I would go on voter drives, voter registration drives, right? And then in the office, I would clean up the office and, you know, empty ashtrays. We used to smoke then. And so all of those things. So I never aspired to leadership. I just wanted to be an observer and learn. Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you want to be part of the leadership?
That's a good question. And that was probably, maybe I didn't, in the military I had risen through the ranks to some degree. When I didn't go to West Point, the Army sent me to train in combat engineers, and I wound up in missile artillery, right? And became a launcher crew chief and stuff like that. I don't know why. Well, I think there were other things here. That in Raza Unida, there were some powerful personalities. There were people, mainly guys, who were well liked. They were flamboyant. Ramsey Muniz, who was running for governor, and those well-known, good-looking guys and stuff like that, right? And that wasn't me. My style has always been to be quiet and, you know, and to do my work. I've never, I don't know, I've always sought knowledge and not, you know, to lead. Though when we have to, we do it, right? But yeah, I'd rather be reading science or something.
So when you were at A&I, were you involved in any other organizations other than the Chicano movement?
No, I was just, I made studying a religion. So for all the years I was there, every day, including weekends, I would divide each day into 15-minute sections. And so when I was not in the classroom, if I had 15 minutes, I would study in those 15 minutes. I became totally dedicated, and partly through my father as well, because my father got used to me coming home with 100s in my exams, and so he demanded it. Anything less than 100, he thought was a failure or something, right? So I just threw myself into studying. So I didn't get involved into partying or dating, not too much, or whatever. It was just study, 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 study.
Do you, when you think about it, do you kind of wish that you maybe would have branched out of studying a little bit and how to?
No, I enjoyed it. See, I realized, look, we're poor when I was growing up in the neighborhood, right? But we don't have to be powerless. That in my neighborhood, there were people who had power because they had guns and gangs, right? But I was never going to have that, right? But then I learned that knowledge is power. And that's the type of power that I thought, knowledge, right? So I was totally convinced that was the way to do it. And I just liked science, I don't know.
What were some of your favorite readings about science?
How's that?
What were some of your favorite readings about science?
Everything that I could pick up, any science magazine, keeping up with Einstein, astronomy became a favorite topic, right? But also social science. We learned statistics and analysis, right? So I was in it. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I understand that you and a few other students would commute to Texas A&I several times a week. How was that?
Can you repeat that again?
You guys would commute to Texas A&I from?
Yeah, we lived in Corpus, right? And it's not that far from Kingsville, and it was like, why move to Kingsville if we can commute to 45-minute bus ride? And so yeah, we made friends, right? And we conversed, and you develop friendships, right? Or sometimes the students in your class are with you in the bus. So I think that the commute became a supportive mechanism, another way to encourage each other, to share notes, and think about ideas for term papers and things like that.
So it was a bus ride. It wasn't a car ride. It was a bus ride.
Well, at first it was a bus ride, and then it became I got a. Well, at first, let me see. At one point it was a bus ride. Another point it was a car ride. If I had a car, right? When I had a car, I bought a car, right? And then my neighbor, who was also going to Kingsville, would go with me, right? So usually always someone to talk with, think of strategies to survive a course or do better, right?
So how much would you guys have to pay for the bus ride?
It wasn't much. You bought a ticket, but it wasn't anything huge. I don't remember now that you're asking me. I wish I knew. I remembered $12. I don't know, something. But it wasn't prohibitive. Mm-hmm.
So how many days would you guys go? Because you were
5 days.
5 days out of the week?
Yeah, because I crammed. I mean, I wanted to, keep in mind, I went to the Army for 3 years, so I felt I was behind for 3 years. My friends at my age had already graduated, and I was still going to college.
So you were going Monday through Friday. What would you do on the weekends? Were you working? Study?
Yeah, I didn't have to go. Coming back out of the Army, I had the GI Bill.
GI Bill.
And I had scholarships and things like that. Huh. So yeah, I just studied. Okay, on Sundays afternoons, I'd go play football with friends or something like that. It wasn't like every single minute, right? But studying was the dominant activity for me.
So how did you end up buying your own car? What was that, through the scholarship money?
Because I had saved money when I was in the military.
Do you remember?
They don't pay you much, but you don't have to use much. They give you clothing or food, right? So you can save.
Do you remember what the car was? Was that your first car when you?
Malibu, 19-something Malibu, Chevy. My father always bought Chevys. He thought they were the best. So I kept the tradition. That's a traditional family.
Do you still? What happened to the car? Do you still have it? Did you get rid of it?
No, the car it died. The motor or something. I think the block cracked or something. Maybe even a freeze or something. I don't know.
So how long were you guys riding the bus for before you would go into the car and you would drive?
I mean, it could have been maybe a year and a half or something like that. It's hard to tell because sometimes, the cars would break down, so we're going to take the bus, right? So it's alternating. And sometimes the car for a long time, and sometimes the bus for a long time.
Was there ever the car ride and the bus ride? Was it ever sometimes soothing, just the 45 minutes just to get to class? Was it ever just felt nice?
Did it feel nice commuting?
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it. It was just on the way to campus, right? You're anticipating lectures and exams and things like that. Right? We did drive through the countryside, the cotton fields, so I could identify with a little bit or a lot.
What time would you guys have to leave at? And
Oh God, it depends when your class is, right? But usually in the 7 in the morning, we're on the bus or in the car headed to Kingsville.
you guys would commute back as well?
Yeah, coming back after classes.
And what time would you guys, so,
4:30, something like that.
okay. So
Yep.
sometimes a normal bus ride like today's.
Yeah.
So when you went to math, you were originally a science person.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still consider yourself a science person?
Very much so. I mean, I use the scientific method in research.
And you ended up majoring in sociology and government. And how did science and math kind of lead into that?
Well, in sociology, we do research. So we have theories, hypotheses, we gather data, we test hypotheses. So it's still the basic model, that you're collecting data to try to answer questions, research questions, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty happy with it. And for many years, I taught statistics. So that kept me close to math. So it worked.
And going into government, how did you go into
Government was important because it was about political relationships. Yeah, and so that was an important angle. Though I specialized a little bit in public administration because government also teaches public administration classes, right? And so I got actually a national fellowship from the National Association of Public Administration to go. I could have come to like LBJ school or something like that to study public administration. But at the end, I decided, no, I want to stay in research. And so I stayed in sociology. When I graduated from my BA, with my BA in Kingsville, I went to grad school there. And when I went to grad school there, and when I finished grad school in Kingsville, got my master's, then I went to work in Corpus Christi city administration for the city government for a few months. And then Stanley Bittinger called me back to A&I and said, do you want to be an instructor for us? We need instructors. So I went back to Kingsville and became a professor. I think I was 25 years old when I started teaching as a professor.
Oh, wow. 25 years old.
Yeah.
That's the dream. All right. Well, we got a couple questions from the students watching inside the classroom.
Sure.
And so one of the things was, how do you think the violence you experienced growing up affected you?
Well, you know what? I think that it didn't affect me when I saw the violence, right? I think it affected me later. It's like trauma, but it doesn't affect you immediately for whatever reasons, right? Because it's normal life. I mean, it's not normal for most neighborhoods, but for us it was normal, right? But then later it gets you because it comes back to you, I think. And that's it's hard to talk about sometimes. Mm-hmm.
When do you think you realized that?
Excuse me?
When did you like?
When did I realize that? I think in my early 40s.
Early 40s.
I realized, I thought I had left it behind. I didn't. Yeah.
So when did you discover the concept of race?
The what?
When did you discover the concept of race? When did you realize?
When did I discover when I discovered the concept of social structure in Texas A&I taking Introduction to Sociology.
How did that work? What happened? I'm curious. Did it like turn on a light bulb in your head?
Well, when you study sociology, you study social categories and relationships and institutions, right? And you begin to understand that sometimes some institutions are dominated by certain interests, not your group, but somebody else's group, right? And that in societies there's a distribution of wealth, and often the distribution is unequal, and people are excluded, right, from certain opportunities, right? So I began to understand that to understand inequality and race and how that affected inequality, we had to understand the organization of society, which was a big moment for me. I've always thought and have said that when I learned the concept of social structure, I solved for me an intellectual question of inequality. I mean, growing up, I would ask my step-grandmother, who lived in the next house from our house, why are Mexicans always poor and whites have money, right? And my step grandmother, who was a religious woman, would say, "Well, God has, given us a plan, and we accept it. And when we die, our reward is waiting for us." And so that was a religious explanation, right? God's plan, right? Which was never satisfying, but I accepted it. But then taking sociology, right, I learned about relationships and institutions and social control, right?
Oh, wow. Okay. Gonna try my best to read this one. The handwriting's a little. Okay. When's the first time you realized your area had lost education opportunities than other places in Texas?
But the first time that I realized,
I guess to put it more simply, when did you realize that like Corpus had less education opportunities?
you know what? I didn't realize that until later, after I went through public school again, uh, studying sociology, I think. Yeah, because one of the things that happens when you see that we don't have opportunity, right? The Mexican American neighborhoods, where schools, whatever, we don't know about institutions yet, right? And we have faith in the system, right? And so when you see somebody failing and doing poorly because of lack of opportunity, you don't think of that. You think that the individual is weak. So you think, well, they're bad students. They're not like me. And so I was giving myself false explanations of the consequences of lack of opportunity, right? Later I got it, right? But to be honest, my father was always a voice on the side telling me there's inequality here. The Mexicans don't control power or resources, and that's why we suffer or have less opportunity, right? So I would also listen to my father, right? But the persons that I saw that weren't doing well, they could have done better with better schools. I used to think they're not doing well because they don't want to dedicate themselves. I thought that to do well, you had to dedicate yourself 100%, turn education into a religion. And if you did that, you would be okay. I never realized that normal people don't do that. You shouldn't have to do that. That if society was more equal, we would have more opportunity.
Wow. So going in with the academic setting,
Sure.
do you ever felt you were discriminated because of your race?
Oh, yes. I mean, Corpus Christi, again, there was no legal segregation for Mexican Americans, but there was a practice segregation. So a couple of times I would go into stores where only whites were allowed, but they wouldn't put a big sign that would say whites only, right? So you wander in there and then you're asked to leave, and so that's discrimination. You feel it, right? And it's kind of like, it's a confusing situation because you're in a store, right? They don't like Mexican Americans in there, but there's no sign, so you think you're okay. And then here's a clerk walking towards you, and she's smiling, like she's gonna tell you something nice, right? And then she tells you need to leave because we don't allow you in here, right? And the reason she's smiling is because she doesn't want to create a scene because there are white customers all around, see? So she doesn't want to shout at you. But if I come to you smiling and you think I'm going to say something nice, and if I tell you, well, I'm going to give you an F, you get shocked. And thus, I mean, by then, I was a teenager and it was clear, segregation, discrimination was there, right?
Did you ever experience that in A&I?
Did what?
Did you ever experience that in A&I?
No. Well, I mean, I experienced one professor who was like impatient or wasn't nice, but I just thought he was impatient and wasn't nice against everyone. So we used to have a joke. I had an African American friend who was a professor there still at A&I, and we used to say, yeah, he discriminates, but he discriminates against everyone, including whites. It was just a joke,
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
What was so kind of going back to when to the Horace's Clarence's wife, who was the wife that was happy that you went to West Point. What was her name? Do you remember her name?
God, you know what? I just remember. I was just going to say Mrs. Cleveland. In those days, you could say those. Today, you have to say Miss or something like that. You know what? I'm so sorry I don't remember her name because she never lost, as I was told, she never lost faith in me. Well, Mr. Cleveland, rightfully so, lost faith in me because I just abandoned. I didn't even go to say I'm not going to work here anymore. I just never went back. I remember I called a friend, this young woman who worked in the office, and I said, "Tell them all that I'm joining the army and not coming back." And she was, and I said, "Call my parents and tell them the same thing." She said, "Are you crazy? I'm not going to do that, right?" And so I don't remember her name. I wish I did. Mm-hmm.
She must have been very important. Well, she was probably very important at that point in your life when you realized, oh, somebody actually.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel badly, right? I mean, because after I came back from the army, I realized what I had done, right? And I felt guilty and things like that.
So, when you were traveling to Delmar, guys went on the bus. Do you remember what bus it was? Was it Greyhound? Was it?
No. When I was traveling, Delmar's in Corpus Christi, so I didn't need to take a bus to Kingsville.
To Kingsville.
Taxi, and it was a shuttle bus, a special white bus that was just a shuttle bus. It wasn't a city bus or anything like that.
Just
a line of buses. Mm-hmm.
So this one's actually another good one. Do you remember the name of the governor that came when the Chicano?
God, I mean, I don't remember. It must have been in the 71 or something like that. And it was politics, right? And no matter who it would have been, it was the time. Not only was there the Chicano, there were many things involved in Chicano. Part of it was labor organizing the farm workers in South Texas. So we got involved with that. Antonio Orendain had been with Cesar Chavez in California. Cesar Chavez never came to Texas to organize farm workers. Cesar Chavez wanted to skip over Texas and organize in Florida. But Antonio Orendain left the farm worker movement in California and dedicated himself to organizing farm workers in Texas, in South Texas. And so when the governor came, he might have been a big rancher, and so there was a special interest in protesting, but I don't remember the name. Mm-hmm.
So when you were growing up, did you ever struggle with speaking English?
I didn't learn English till I was like in the second grade. We didn't have kindergarten or pre-kinder, whatever. I still say thank God. I didn't. You know what? I was very successful in school, but I never really liked it in terms of the attendance, and I liked studying, but I didn't like taking tests or things like that. So I didn't know the alphabet complete. I knew the letters, but I didn't know the right order, right, till about the third grade or the third grade. So I guess at the beginning I probably stumbled with English. Mm-hmm.
So when we were talking about the Chicano movement, do you identify yourself as Chicano?
I do, but I identify myself as 20 different things. As a professor, as being part of UT Austin, you know what I'm saying? As ex-military, all those things, right? As a friend, as a brother and a sister to everyone, right? I don't just have one identity. I have 50.
So how did you narrow in sociology? How did you know this was it? This is what I want to study.
That's a good question. I guess the theory is what drew me in. I like theory, and it began to explain things to me, like, discrimination, social structures, right, institutions, and I began to understand the world. I remember, like, it took me a good day or two to decide that I was going to change from physics to sociology, and I searched. And I remember reading Socrates saying that a life unexamined is a life not worth living, or something like that. So I thought, I'm going to learn a lot about society that I didn't know, and began to understand how we treat each other the way we do, and how resources are distributed, and how people have opportunities and others don't. So it was more like an intellectual conversion.
So going into sociology and kind of keeping in that topic, when you were growing up and when you were going to school, how often did you speak How often did you speak Spanish? And when you look at it now, Did you ever think you spoke too much Spanish, or did you?
When I was going to school, like what level?
I guess throughout school, just from elementary.
Yeah, but at home, my parents spoke Spanish, you know. And so in my neighborhood, children always spoke to their parents in Spanish. It would be rude and a sign of disrespect to talk to your parents in English because they didn't understand it, or that's not the language of the home culture. When I moved to Houston after I got my PhD here, I was very surprised to see Mexican American families in Houston where the parents and the children spoke English. I'd never seen that. So I always spoke Spanish at home. And with the guys, we have a language, we call it code switching, right? In South Texas, where we mix English and Spanish together so that the verb may be English or the noun may be Spanish, right? And so we can blend it in together. The syntax, right? Which is probably a very sophisticated communication system. Can you imagine doing that, right? Maintain the verb tenses and agreement and all of that in two languages.
I think
It's done. We don't do it consciously. It's subconscious.
yeah, I've seen it happen before. It's some
Yeah.
people like to call it Spanglish or.
Yeah, I don't think Spanglish sounds like it's deficient or something, right? I'm not quite. But this is a totally new level of communication.
Did you ever speak to your parents like that? Does it happen now or?
No. My older brother, at one point, he took a different road. He got into his way to cope with minority group status was to stop being Hispanic. And so he changed his name legally to English in court, and he stopped using Spanish. So he only used English. And so he would talk to my parents in English, and my parents understood English, they just didn't speak it. And so, that was the other version.
What was your brother's name and what did he change it to?
His name was Valente Rodriguez, and he changed it to Frank Larson.
Frank Larson.
I think he got that from a novel or something.
Do you know which novel?
Yeah, it's about Jack, who writes about like the North or something, like the famous Jack London or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the name of the novel, but the novel they used the name Frank Larson.
Is your brother? Did you still talk to your brother today, or?
He passed away actually a few years ago.
How did that kind of affect you when your brother realized he didn't want to be Convalente?
Well, at first, he did that when I was involved with the Chicano movement and stuff like that, right? And I thought it was a cultural disloyalty and things like that. But then I understood it more as that's his way of coping with, with intense racism. He applied to universities. There was a time in which, like UT would only accept whites, right? And so in those days, when you applied to a university, you had to send there was a little spot where you put your picture. So he got accepted at may have been here or somewhere else, but he didn't put his picture on the application, and then they asked for it. They told him conditionally accepted, and when the picture went in, they told him, sorry, you're not accepted. So, I mean, that was his way of coping, was to change his identity. And so later I respected that, right? People, you can't judge everyone by your own standards, right?
So, your father played a major impact growing up with you. Do you think if your father never gave you those science books, those college books, do you think you'd be here today?
God, I'm afraid, I worry that I might not be here, because he put those books in my hand, And then, but he left me, I mean, he also left me some value. When he died, he didn't leave anything where he didn't have an old hammer or saw, something like that. But he left behind important values like don't be afraid to work, be honest, help other people, right? Don't judge other people, So he left me some values that help guide me through life.
So did that kind of influence you to attend A&I? Those
No, I attended A&I because it was nearby, right? No one had gone to a university in my family, or even finished high school except maybe a few cousins, right? So Del Mar was like a big thing for us. And in those, in those days, junior colleges, I'm not going to call them community colleges. Junior colleges were real junior colleges. You had Most of the professors had PhDs, and were very good at research and things like that. So I didn't feel, and I didn't know anything about other universities, so I didn't feel like I was selecting an institution of higher education that was weak, right? And so Kingsville was nearby, so that was the place to go. Mm-hmm.
So, after you received your PhD, because you got it here from UT Austin,
UT Austin.
you came back years later to become a professor in
Yeah.
2008, I believe that.
Yes, fall of 2008.
How did you come upon that position? You were an instructor at 25. Much later, you come here to UT.
Yeah.
How did you get the position of being a
How
professor?
did I? Well, they advertised a position in migration research in sociology. And so I applied. I think 4 or 5 people applied, and I was lucky to be the one selected for it. Yeah.
How did that make you feel coming?
It was great. I mean, for some reason, maybe even I don't understand. I don't want to live outside Texas. I like to visit. I've been all over many places in the world, right? But I always like to come back to Texas. This is my home, my family's home, my grandparents, right? So, but if you're going to be a professor in Texas, you want to be a professor in the best university in Texas, and this is it. So I'm actually living my dream. Mm-hmm.
So, you were talking about Stanley Bellinger, and that you try to channel kind of his mentorship.
Right.
How does that, impact you and your students?
Well, sometimes I think, and this is self-evaluation, that I'm probably a pretty easy professor. Okay, you got to talk to my students, and they can explain that. But what I'm trying to do is duplicate Stanley Bellinger. I'm trying to be what he was to me.
And how does that kind of, do your students ever come to you and tell you, it's like, oh, give you good remarks?
Yeah, normally I get good evaluations, not all the time, right? Sometimes it's a little below, but yeah. But yeah, I've had a couple of students that kind of surprised me. I remember before I was here, I was in Houston for 24 years, University of Houston, right? And probably one of the best comments of gratitude was an African-American student who, after a particularly successful lecture, this African-American student who was majoring in education or something like that, who was going to be a teacher, he said, when I become a teacher, I want to be just like you.
How did that make you feel?
Wow, man. I've never, I thought that was pretty good. I mean, wow, that's kind of like, how do I say, 'cause these are smart people who've had it rough, and they're going to probably be in rough schools, right? But they appreciate a sense of appreciation, right? And it gives you a sense you're doing something right. Maybe not all the time, but you're doing something right. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Texas was your home.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you're ever going to go back to South Texas, or do you?
Oh, I go every month to visit my mother. She's 94. She's in Corpus Christi.
She's Corpus Christi.
So I go there. And I like to go to visit the border area. I teach a border course, so I need to stay in touch, right? But, again, like I said, if you're going to be a university professor in Texas, this is the place to do it, UT Austin, the best. And I think if you're going to live in Texas, Austin is, for me, the best place to live in.
Best place. Mm-hmm. Well, so it wasn't a difficult decision to come to Austin then?
Not at all. I've had in my life has been changed by 2 phone calls in big ways. When I got my master's at Texas A&M in Kingsville, and I went to work in Corpus Christi in City Hall, all right, as a municipal employee, I worked for Manpower Planning Office. And I was, it was okay, but it wasn't like the great challenge I liked and wanted, right? And then one evening, I think it was a Tuesday, like at 7 in the evening, I got a phone call, and it was Stanley Bellinger, who said, how would you like to come back to the university and be an instructor with us? We need instructors. And so that brought me back to the university and got me back and made me a professor, right? And then I decided this is what I want, and I decided to come here, right, and get a PhD so I could make it permanent. So that was very important. The other important phone call was one that I got out of here, telling me that I had gotten the job. The faculty in sociology voted to hire me, and it was like being invited to heaven or something. Yeah, that it was that meaningful to me. Yeah, it meant everything.
Sounds amazing. So, you're growing up in the low education places like Corpus Christi back then.
Yeah.
The South Texas Border Initiative, it's kind of changed that area. Do you think you've seen some differences compared to now to then? Growing up in the 50s.
You mean like the situation in the border area?
Yeah.
I guess you know what. There's more restriction today. There are more barriers at the border. There's many more border patrol, right? But in a way, for me, from my life's perspective, I think growing up, we feared the border patrol in the 1950s. They were all white. They were all male, right? And we knew the history. We had heard stories of Mexican Americans who had been thrown into Mexico by Border Patrol, who were U.S. citizens, right? But in those days, we had no voice, and so we feared the Border Patrol, right? And I remember my parents. We didn't have a car then. We used to go in a Continental bus, or not a Greyhound, but similar to a Greyhound. And my parents would kind of get very nervous when the bus came to the checkpoint, and they'd pull out their folded birth certificates, and to make sure they'd have their baptismal certificates that also showed they were baptized, right, in Corpus or near Corpus. And they were very afraid every time we passed Border Patrol checkpoints. But today there's more enforcement, yet I don't have fear anymore. I'm not saying they can't hurt me. Of course they can hurt me, but I'm not afraid because I understand the system. In fact, I write about it. I write books on it, and I research it, right? But even though it's more restrictive, more enforcement, my fear is gone.
And let's a little bit about higher education. How has that changed from from the 50s to now?
Oh God, that's a very good question too. It changed dramatically that many people of color and women going to the universities now and college, and not just because people opened up their hearts to let the excluded in, but because of things that were happening, the GI Bill, World War II, and the GI Bill, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, right? In fact, a quick story here, because my brother and I were like the only at first in the family, extended family, to go to college. I remember my cousins couldn't figure out why we needed to go to college after high school, because they thought that's high school, you graduated, now you're educated. And so they couldn't figure it out. Why was I keep going back to get another degree in college? Until they heard that I was getting the GI Bill. Then they thought, oh, that's the angle. You're going to school just so you can get free money from the government. So that's one story. The other story is, and the literature doesn't recognize this, but it needs to be recognized, that when the Soviet Union put the first satellite up in space, Sputnik, that the U.S. government kind of freaked out and began to develop programs to promote higher education so that we would catch up to the Russians or something, right? And in those programs, they created something called national defense loans, right? And that was money for people, including minorities, to go to college, right? And build libraries and stuff like that. So one of the things that helped Mexican American students were the national defense loans. I think my brother had one, right? And thanks to the Russians sending Sputnik into space and the fear of Washington that we were falling behind, and that higher education needed to be promoted, people, Mexican Americans and others, began to get an opportunity to go to college.
And do you think now do you see more Hispanics going to college?
Yeah, you know what? When I started going to college, I thought that everybody would follow me, my cousins and things. So there are more, but not as many as we need. It's not a linear development,
All right. Your cousin. Okay, so here we have another question. Your cousins who thought you were crazy, or or in this phrase, nuts to go to college. What did they end up doing?
Uh, well, they work hard. They, working manual jobs, right? Trying to raise families. Sometimes unemployed. Working class, minority areas. You don't always have job security, right? But I mean, now obviously they come around and they understood what happened. And I've gotten distant from them because I spend all of my time in Austin. I'm not back in Corpus, right, with the family. But I could understand because they didn't understand. Nobody had gone to college, right? And the big thing was high school. Let me tell you, when I graduated from high school, the family came. Everybody came to celebrate. That was the big graduation for Mexican Americans, right? When I graduated from my BA, my MA, and PhD, nobody came because they didn't understand it. You know, as far as they knew, I already graduated. What's a BA? What's an MA? What's a PhD, right? It didn't bother me because I understood, right, that they didn't have opportunities like I created and my father helped create, right? And the good people like Stanley Bittinger and good high school teachers helped create for me. Mm-hmm.
And you have these highs, degrees. Your cousins, did they have kids? Did they?
Yeah, and I'm happy to say that some of them now are. I have one of my cousins' sons is getting a BA in Corpus Christi in nursing, RN, registered nurse, and in sociology. Right. So again, it's not like a whole new cohort is flowing into college, right? It's a trickle, but it's something, and hopefully it'll develop into more. Mm-hmm.
And has he ever talked to you and tell you it's like you were an inspiration or anything such as that?
Unfortunately, and this is my fault because I live in Austin and my family lives in Corpus. We don't have much interaction, so I'm not an inspiration directly to anyone, And I know that, and I feel guilty about it sometimes, that I should be there, being a role model for some of my, for my cousins' children or whatever, but my job is here, right?
But when you do go back, do you ever try to talk to them and ask them if they're...
I did, in fact, give them my when I buy a new computer, I give them my computers and stuff, yeah. No, I was there this weekend. There was a funeral, and I met the clan, the family. We had a great time, right? Not because of the funeral, but because of the family reunion, right? And so, yeah, there are moments, yeah, and, that we can do something.
Does it feel nice knowing?
Yeah.
The new generation wants to learn?
How's that?
Does it feel nice that the new generation wants to learn? Does that make you...
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a great need. I mean, in this country, or the society is in any society, right? Your ability to have a better life is correlated with what they call human capital, how well prepared, how much education you have, things like that. And so to see people have an opportunity to study means they have a great opportunity to have a better life than others who didn't. Yeah.
What struggles do they go through now are there any different struggles that they have, when you were growing up, educational-wise?
No, in fact, I think the schools are probably better, public schools, things like that. So they should. I mean, when I went to public school, I didn't know English at the beginning, right? It was sink or swim, right? And luckily, I survived, right? It was a lot of help from a lot of people, good teachers, right? And so, I don't know about this because I don't know what their educational experiences are, but they seem to be graduating from high school more and more, so that's always great. You can't go to second base unless you go to first base, so that's good and good.
All right. Well, so I think I have one more.
Yeah, sure.
So your studies focus on migration. How does your background, kind of...
How does the background, my personal background affect my research, right? And it has given me a great resource to do research with migrants from Latin America, from Mexico and Central America. Because for two reasons, I know Spanish, right? And this is not the official academic Spanish of, that you in Madrid, right? This is Corpus Christi street Spanish, right? And so I know the vocabulary of working class people, and I know the styles, the mannerisms, and what builds trust with other people, right? And that's been a very important resource for me. If I hadn't had that background, I don't think I could have done what I've done. And so not that I've done a lot, right? But I've done something. And so it's been a huge resource. I'm glad. Let me tell you, when I was growing up, one of my father's brothers would not permit Spanish in his house. All his children, my cousins, had to use only English. And he meant well. He wanted them to know English when they went to school already, so they would have a greater success, probability of success, right? So, but I grew up learning Spanish, right, and becoming bilingual. And so when I started doing research with migrants from Latin America, it was just an important resource for me. And it wasn't just that I knew words in Spanish. I knew the mannerisms of working class people.
And going to like Latin America and those places, do you feel connected to them? Do you feel?
I do feel, and I've been to China many times, Vietnam, Japan, and I feel connected not just to Latin America. I find that people, you can connect with people if you're sincere, right? You gain their trust, and I made great friends in China, right? So I owe that to my profession, research, mixing with other cultures and stuff. So I sometimes tell my students I feel like I'm a brother to all men and to all women. I'm part of the family, the human family.
So it's just not just the working class.
Not just the working class, no.
All right. I don't know. I don't think I have anything else to ask. I'm not sure if Maggie has anything.
Okay.
Maggie? All right. Well, maybe there might be something. Actually, now I've asked all the questions I could
Well,
probably
great.
ask.
Thank you
Well, thank you
for your
Thank
time.
you.